Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most Radiohead-inspired podcast in the world. We are your hosts, myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And as always, we have a guest. We are going to be introducing Josh. He's making his first appearance on the podcast.
Hello.
How are you doing?
Welcome.
I'm doing all right.
Thanks for coming on. We're excited to have you on because we are doing a Muse Worst to Best.
Woo!
Woo!
Yeah.
I love Muse.
I love Radiohead. Anyways, we know you were expecting the Swans Worst to Best at this stage, but unfortunately we had scheduling issues, so we have to put Muse beforehand, but hopefully expect the Swans episode to be the next thing that comes up. And let's get right into it.
Unfortunately, and this is an unpopular opinion, but Muse is the better band. That's why we're doing Muse.
I agree. Muse are the better band. What do Radiohead have? They don't have the second law.
All right. Number 8.
Anyways, number 8. We got 8 albums to go through. Number 8, my worst pick. I chose the second law.
I also chose the second law.
For number 8, I chose Drones.
Original.
Anyways, the second law. I wouldn't call a lot of Muse albums bad, but if I had to call any Muse album just bad, I would call the second law just really bad. This album's just really bad, man. Like, Muse needed to evolve their sound somehow and drive it forward, but I didn't need that drive forward to be off a fucking cliff. Like, this is the furthest thing that you'd probably want an alternative rock band to go to, and like they incorporate a load of electronics from the era of where this album came from. Nice wording there, and it's just overproduced to shit. Like, the more electronics incorporated make it sound like a hollow and soulless shell of what the band used to be. Like why is there like bro step influences? Like, they're aneurysm inducing, and I hate the vocals. I hate Matthew Bellamy's vocal lines. Some of them are just borderline unlistenable. It just sounds so shit in my opinion. The songwriting isn't all that interesting, and every song on here bar one ranges from being headache inducing to migraine fuel. I like some of the riffs, and that one song I genuinely think is great is in my best tracks, but yeah, this album's just kind of shit in it.
Facts. Absolute facts. I'm not a fan. I think the second law is a fucking mess. I think a lot of the songs on here share the exact same issues. I think the songs feature very forced and just awkward sounding vocals from Matt Bellamy that are really poorly mixed, and those vocals are over some of the most skeletal yet somehow still really like overblown and synthetic instrumentals I've heard ever from Muse. It's just their most like sloppy, messy, just horrid album. I think it has some good tracks, emphasis on some, but a lot of the stuff on here is a fucking mess. I really don't think a song could have aged worse than, Follow Me and Unsustainable did, but somehow they did it. And I do think it's quite funny that because of those two songs, this album has a bro step subgenre on Rate Your Music. So if there's something good to come from this, it's the fact that Muse have an album that is under the bro step subgenre. So thank you, Second Law.
Exactly.
Ditto.
Of course, I had to pick Drones and be different because whatever. But I should preface before we go on. I used to stand this band so hard, and I remember when Drones was coming out, I was so excited. I was, Psycho dropped. It was like the rollout was happening. Like, people were hyped. I was hyped. Then Psycho dropped, and I was like, oh, okay. They used that classic Muse riff that they used to close their shows. Weird they turned it into a song, but okay, I'm on board. Then more singles kept coming out. They released like half the album before it came out. And I listened to it, and I was like, you know what? This was pretty good. And then I grew out of it. I took a step back, and I listened to this album again, and I thought, oh my god, this is horrible. The Drones for me is it's a band trying. It's like when the band said they were going back to their roots. This is like the most failed attempt I've ever heard at going back to your roots. I think like it's so lazy. It's so boring. The concept is very skeletal and basic, and it's so overblown, and like they tried to make classic rock, and I mean obviously they tried to hire Mutt Lange, who was AC/DC's producer, so I mean only good could come from that. And I even remember like they were hyping this album up so hard, and they mentioned the song in The Globalist, and they no joke on social media were labeling the song Citizen Erased 2 during the album rollout. I was so hyped for that song, and I heard it and I was like, this is awful. Like this whole album is just awful. It's Second Law has its problems, we'll get to that, but I think Drones is just a band Drones just sounds like a band who is just phoning it in and is just trying to make like dad rock. So I never wanted Muse to make dad rock. I just wanted them to make interesting music, and this album is just not interesting, and some of the songs on here just genuinely piss me off, so I'm having flashbacks. Just I need to stop.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Moving on to our best and worst tracks. My favorite song from The Second Law is Supremacy. The worst tracks are Follow Me, Save Me, Liquid State, and The Second Law Unsustainable.
My favorite tracks on The Second Law were Panic Station and Explorers. My least favorite tracks were Madness, Follow Me, Save Me, and The Second Law Unsustainable.
For Drones, my favorite tracks were Reapers and The Handler. That was hard to pick. My least favorite tracks are Psycho, Revolt, Aftermath, and The Globalist. Psycho is their worst track, by the way.
I'd hesitate to call it their worst track. They've made far worse songs.
Follow Me.
I can't. The Psycho, get out of my brain.
All right. Fair enough.
All right. Moving on to our number 7 picks. I chose Simulation Theory.
I chose Drones.
I chose The Second Law.
All right. So, Simulation Theory. Muse's most recent effort saw the band commit to like going like into more electro pop and embracing like the synthwave aesthetic, and it couldn't be any more of a cash grab because at the time like the 80s throwback shit was just popular at the time, and Muse unfortunately fell into that kind of lane of trying to appeal to that kind of crowd, and honestly it couldn't have been any more of a failed attempt on here. Like, even the album cover was made by the same person who made the fucking Stranger Things cover. Like, which is pretty much the epitome of that whole, like, 80s nostalgia fad. While I think the album does have a couple of tracks that I do genuinely enjoy, it also has its many lows. Like, there's so many tracks on this thing that are just so campy and just so cheesy. Like, the production, it sounds fine, and it sounds fine sometimes. Like, there are actually a few moments that I thought were pretty cool, but like a load of the stuff they incorporated was just campy as shit, like, and I just couldn't take it all that seriously because of that camp. And honestly, sometimes they can pull off that kind of like campiness on some like songs that they've made in the past, but on Simulation Theory it just got out of hand and just got grating to listen to, honestly. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Drones, I very much agree with what Josh said. I think this was just a poor attempt to do something that was obviously very forced, that didn't really represent what the band ever stood for. and the final result is another fucking awful album. I think the lows aren't quite as low as they are in the second law, but throughout this is just some of the most unremarkable and unmemorable and cheesy material the band has ever come out with. It's just track after track of just overbearing instrumentals, very rough production, really cheesy political themes, and just an overall uninteresting arena hard rock aesthetic that just doesn't work with the band at all. And yeah, I think it's awful.
Fair enough. So,
that was quick.
So here I am.
Jesus.
Here I am. Here I am catching up with the second law because yes, this album is bad. And it's another thing where I also stand this band so hard that I also liked this album a lot when I first heard it. Fun fact, Madness was actually the song that got me back into the band when I hadn't heard them in a long time. So I guess I will give that song credit. Don't worry. I'll get to it.
God.
But here, when I listen to this album now, I mean, Muse has always been known for, taking risks and doing like a little bit of experimentation in the studio, and sometimes they'll inch a little bit closer to that line of where it just goes too far. And I think this album is where they just went too far. Like there are way too many gimmicks on this album, and they aged poorly. Like they aged like milk. There's like the overblown electronics, and just like this like it just sounded like they were trying to make every song like bigger and bigger and bigger. And the bro step. it's I mean Unsustainable is a, I don't want to live in a world where that song doesn't exist, honestly. But I mean, it's just a strange album to listen to by them because they're very well known for their grandiosity, but it's I mean, this album they're blowing the speakers out. It's not a very fun listen. There are a few tracks where they have those riffs going down, but other than that, they just kind of threw a bunch of stuff at the wall, and it did not stick.
Fair enough. My favorite tracks from Simulation Theory were Algorithm, The Dark Side, and Break It To Me. The worst tracks were Thought Contagion and Something Human.
My favorite track on Drones was The Handler. My least favorite tracks were Dead Inside, Reapers, and Effector.
My favorite tracks on the second law were Supremacy, Survival, and Animals. My least favorites were Madness, Follow Me, Big Freeze, and Save Me.
All right.
Unsustainable didn't make worse tracks.
I can't do it, man. It's too good.
I getcha.
I don't get you, but okay. All right, moving on to our number 6 pick. I chose Drones.
I chose The Resistance.
I chose Simulation Theory.
All right. So Drone. Yeah, same order. So yeah, Drones. It's yeah. Honestly, I think it gets way too much shit than it deserves. But I will say this record isn't very good. It does have its issues. Like the concept is pretty corny. And it's not written very well. It doesn't really flesh itself out at all throughout the album. And the production on this thing is pretty mediocre. The hard rock and arena rock styles I thought would blend well with a band like Muse, but it just comes off pretty overblown and not very interesting. The electronic and symphonic and over-the-top elements don't really mesh well with what's going on in the instrumentation at all. It has a couple of songs that I like, but it has plenty of misses, I will say. I do like some of the riffs on this thing, and you're probably going to hate me for liking Psycho, but I actually like it. And yeah, I don't really have much to say about this. It's definitely one of Muse's weakest moments in their discography. But I'd take it any day over Simulation Theory and The Second Law.
It's okay. Psycho's personal for me. I get
Fair
why
enough.
people like it, but it's personal.
Fair enough.
I'll give the Resistance credit. I think it definitely sounds like a Muse album, unlike the last two. I think, a lot of the characteristics that, make the band Muse are largely there. I will admit here that I'm not the biggest Muse fan, so I will keep it short because my opinion probably matters the least. But I just don't find anything really interesting or original about this album at all. It just feels kind of forced in its approach. I think the grandiose aesthetic of the band is just really overblown and just at times quite unbearable and awkward. I just don't really have much to hold on to here. I don't like most of the songs here. The production I don't care for at all. I think it sounds like far too clean for this, like, the sound and the soundscapes of the band. I just think overall it's a very boring album with not a lot about it that excites me or keeps me interested.
Fair. So for me, I have Simulation Theory here. This actually used to be my least favorite album by them. I won't lie. I was very disappointed when it came out, and I also considered it a cop-out or a cash grab or whatever you want to call it. It's not that great, but where it started to warm up for me, warm up. I'm acting like I like this album. I don't, but it's it's not that great. But for me, at least on this album, they just kind of embraced like what they were trying to do. I feel like on Drones and Second Law, they didn't really. It almost sounds like they weren't buying what they were selling. But on Simulation Theory, it just sounds like they're just like, you know what? Let's just be weird. Like, who cares? And I'm for me, it's just like, sure, okay. I don't like most of the songs, especially when the single rollout happened. I was like, I was still in my stan phase with this band, and they released Dig Down, and I was like, oh no. Please,
Dig Down sounds like a really
this.
bad fucking Queen song.
It does. It sounds so. I was so scared, and then Thought Contagion came out, and I was like, I better, I guess, but I'm not really sold. Then they released The Dark Side, and I was like, okay, I'm starting to warm up a little bit. Then they released Pressure. I was like, okay, like maybe there's just a couple duds on the album. And then Something Human came out. And for me, it's like I said, they embrace their weird sound, but Something Human, that song sounds like a Chainsmokers song. Let's be real. That's exactly that's exactly where they got it from. Like, it sounds like I hate that song. But again, they put that song on an album where I just think they were telling themselves, let's just be weird. Let's just, do whatever. I guess some songs stick to landing, but it's still not really fun to listen to at the end of the day. So that's all I really got to say about that.
Fair enough. Yep. My favorite tracks from Drones are Reapers, The Handler, and Psycho. The worst track is Revolt.
My favorite tracks on Resistance were Resistance and Guiding Light, and my least favorites were Uprising and I Belong to You.
My favorite tracks from Simulation Theory were The Dark Side, Pressure, and Break It To Me. My least favorites were Propaganda, Something Human, Get Up and Fight, and Dig Down.
All right, number 5. We are in the top 5. I chose The Resistance.
I chose Simulation Theory.
I
also chose The Resistance.
Nick and Josh go back to back, so since you have the same album.
Okay, The Resistance. This is often considered where the downfall of Muse began, and I can honestly see why. There are things that I think are good about the album, like the symphonic sequence at the end is a really cool moment. I honestly don't mind Uprising. I think it's a good intro, and I think the more political aspects of Matt Bellamy's lyrics are somewhat decent. And honestly, I think the symphonic rock style suits a band like Muse well, with their kind of dramatic and like grand sound. But ultimately I think a lot of this is very hit or miss. The song structures aren't very interesting at all. A lot of the production is just alright, but it's a bit too overly dramatic, a bit too clean. Plus, it's borderline Queen worship, and not very good Queen worship, may I add. I don't think it's bad by any means. I think it's a decent enough album. There is tracks that I could see myself coming back to, but a lot of the time, just nothing on here, no. Not a lot of things on here do a whole lot for me. Sorry, I can't speak today. But yeah, that's all I really have to say about The Resistance. It's just alright, I'd say.
Nothing on here. I tricked you. I hate this album. No, okay. So, as I mentioned earlier, with The Second Law, it was, that album was them crossing the line with experimentation. And like MickyT mentioned, some people say that, they kind of crossed the line on this album. But I think they teetered on that line and they rode on it without sort of falling. I think that this is where they took some more risks and they actually ended up panning out pretty well for the most part. I think the biggest example of this is the Exogenesis Symphony at the end. I think that's one of the most interesting things that they've done, just because it's like it sounds exactly like what they tried to replicate on The Second Law by being super grandiose. I mean, this band has always been known for grandiosity, and I think that this song kind of was them flexing that muscle. And like, yeah, we can make huge, like a huge 3-part suite and make it sound pretty interesting. For the most part, I don't really have a problem with this album. It's fun. I can put it on from start to finish, and I don't really have too many tracks where I would skip. It's it's solid. It's not as good as their other albums, but I think it's it's pretty safely in the green for me. This album's all right.
Fair enough.
Right. Simulation Theory. First of all, yeah, it's not great, I will admit, but I do think that the overall approach here is somewhat respectable, and it seems kind of self-aware in that it's kind of being this own whole kind of cliche synthwave throwback sound thing, and I don't think it takes itself too seriously, and therefore I think it avoids a lot of cringe that albums like Drones in the Second Law just headed right into. But the execution overall is very sloppy, is very rough around the edges. A lot of tracks are just very scarcely interesting or exciting. It's just a nice little synthwavy inspired pop rock album that doesn't really do anything to establish an identity for itself. It doesn't really break any boundaries, and it does sound very cheesy, but not offensively bad.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks on The Resistance are Uprising, The Symphony Sequence, and Unnatural Selection. The worst track, in my opinion, is Guiding Light.
My favorites... See, this is where the stand comes out. My favorites are Uprising, Resistance, Undisclosed Desires, Unnatural Selection, MK Ultra, and the Exogenesis Symphony. My least favorite is also Guiding Light.
My favorites
on that, at least.
My favorites on Simulation Theory were Algorithm, Blockades, and Avoid. My least favorites were Propaganda and Get Up and Fight.
Fair.
All right. We're halfway through the list now. We're at number 4.
Yeah.
And my number 4 pick is Showbiz.
My number 4 pick is also Showbiz.
My number 4 pick is also Showbiz.
Well, I knew this was going to happen.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
We'll go in the usual order, so.
Yeah. Muse's debut is honestly quite good. There's plenty of things about this that I actually like and I think are great about it. I think that the highs on this album are fantastic, and in my opinion, there's no denying that at all. I think the instrumentals are great. They get the blood pumping, and they play very well. And Matt Bellamy shows that he's a good and capable frontman on here. But I do have a big glaring issue with Showbiz. And I know it's it's generic to say, but like if you're going to compare a Muse project with Radiohead, this is the one. This is the one. The instrumentals on here are very inspired by The Bends and to some degree OK Computer, and there are vocal moments where Matt Bellamy sounds so similar to Tom York that it's actually scary. And honestly, some of the production on this album is a bit rough around the edges, but none of that really stops this from being a good debut in the slightest. Showbiz is a band trying to find their footing while at the same time leaving a good impression on me, because honestly, Showbiz has a lot of great tracks in my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think it's the most impressive debut ever, but I still think it's a good album. I think, as you said, and it's kind of unavoidable with this album, but I think where it suffers is that it lacks its own identity. I think Muse later on did definitely establish an identity for themselves. As funny as the "Oh, Muse, you mean Radiohead" meme is, you know, this is really the only album where the two are just completely like comparable, because yeah, this album just sounds like the Bends pastiche with some like OK Computer inspiration in there as well, especially when it comes to like some of the sonic instrumentation throughout. And you know, I like Radiohead, so it's not the worst thing ever, but it's just, I don't know, it doesn't really stand out in the discography when you look at the albums that came directly after it and had their own flair and identity to them, whereas this kind of just sounds like Radiohead pastiche. I already said that, but it's a strong debut, you know, all things considered, and instrumentation wise especially, I think is very impressive, especially on the guitar end of things. And you know, it's hard to really praise, but it's also not bad at all, and it is enjoyable.
God, all right. Like I keep saying, here comes that 13-year-old Stan. Because I should preface that every album from here on out I consider 9 out of 10. You can say whatever you want about me, but that's where I'm at, because like it pains me that I can't have this album higher on my list, because I think this album is so underrated in their catalog, and it's absolutely fantastic. I think this is like a debut album that I can get behind, where the band is giving it their all, and you know, Dominic Howard is going crazy on the drums on this. I think the drum work is very good on this album. Chris Wolstenholme's bass work on this album is very interesting, and it definitely floats above all of the music that was going on this album, and it just sounds very good. And I mean, Matt Bellamy, this man, he is unabashedly singing his heart out, and he is playing his heart out, and you can just tell through all the songs that he's very passionate about what he was writing, and I can't help but smile when I listen to this album and just have a great time. Now I know there's the you know, the elephant in the room, where, you know, this is where the whole Muse sounds like Radiohead type argument came through. I mean, again, Radiohead, I love Radiohead. They're my favorite band. Spoiler. But here's the thing. This is when I hear that argument, this is the only album where I can sort of see that argument, but I have to squint really hard to see it, because if I'm honest, I can't see it that well, because I mean I'm listening to songs like Muscle Museum or Cave or Showbiz or Uno, or you know, so, like those heavy songs. It's like I don't think Radiohead would have never made a song like this. Like I don't, you know, I think the, you know, their influence kind of lingers because John Leckie produced this album, and John Leckie produced the Bends, and I think in terms of like his production choices, like, you know, maybe he like saw that too and kind of tried to make them sound similar, but I just think that they were trying to come into their own on this album, and they just kind of had to shake off the influences. If that influence was Radiohead or not, I think that they did a fantastic job of just showing us that they were going to be a band to pay attention to in the future.
Fair enough. My favorite tracks from Showbiz are Falling Down, Cave, Showbiz, Unintended, Uno, Sober, Escape, and Hate This and I Love You. And the worst track is Overdue.
My favorite tracks on Showbiz were Sunburn, Muscle Museum, Philip, and Escape. My least favorite tracks were Falling Down and Unintended.
My favorite tracks were Sunburn, Muscle Museum, Cave, Showbiz, Unintended, Uno, Escape, and Overdue. And my least favorite track was Sober. Overdue is so underrated. How could you, Mickey? Sorry, I just had to.
Anyways, we're in the top 3 now. We've made it.
Woo!
Yeah.
Alright, so, my number 3 pick, what I consider Muse's 3rd best album, is Absolution.
My number 3 pick is Black Holes and Revelations.
I will say right now, this was so hard to pick, but if I have to pick an album for number 3, I'm going with Black Holes and Revelations.
Might go first, and then me and Josh.
Okay. Same order then. Yeah, Absolution. This was the first Muse album that I ever heard. And thanks to Louis, of course. And he's probably shaking his keyboard just in anger because I put Absolution so in the 3rd place. But honestly, I like Absolution. I think it is a great album. I think Muse are still striving at their artistic peak at this point, creating an album that's really varied in what it does and ultimately sounds like Muse is yet again shaking up the formula. Like, it's Muse's most cinematic or theatrical album at this point in time, with production that ups the ante with being more symphonic, very dramatic, and more grandiose in its presentation. And I feel like this album does have like the perfect balance between the more grandiose and dramatic sounds of their music, and and unfortunately they went overboard with that kind of shit on albums like The Resistance and fucking The Second Law. But I think this album is great. The tracks on here range from being straight bangers to dramatic slow burners. I think that Chris's bass work on this album is just excellent, to say the least. The drumming is incredible, and I think that Matt Bellamy is just on point throughout this whole album. The instrumentals are great. I love the string arrangements. The guitar work is just so good. Like, whenever pianos are added into the mix, it's a really nice touch, and just the sound is so explosive, and I like that aspect of this album. I mean, after a little bit, Matt Bellamy singing does get a bit annoying, but I like this whole, like, apocalyptic kind of feel, like the end of the world, like music that the end of the world is going on around. And I think that there's a lot of highlights from this album, a lot of songs that I could definitely see myself listening to a fair bit for a long time. And yeah, personally, it's not my favorite Muse album, but it's great nonetheless.
Yeah, I chose Black Holes and Revelations. While I admit I don't think this album is great, I still think it's a good album, and I think the highs on here are absolute masterpieces. Tracks that I'll get to in best and worst tracks, and you know, the very grandiose and kind of off-kilter approach on a lot of these tracks really pays off in the end. I do think that there are a few tracks that in execution or just in overall direction or just not very interesting and kind of just sound like more kind of generic arena rock. But that's definitely a minority when it comes to this album, because you know I'm almost naming tracks the whole time, but I want to keep that till the end for extra content. Yeah, this album just has some fantastic tracks, great ideas, fantastic executions. It's just not as consistent as the albums I ranked above it.
All right. Ah, man. This album. I love this album. And I was wrestling so hard between this album and my number 2 pick. I literally have them at the exact same score. I love them equally. And I should also probably preface that I used to have all 3 of these albums at 10s at one point in my life. So I have a very special connection to this album, and this special connection was making me feel like I was gonna put it at number 2 because I moved. I moved across the country. I was gonna be living in a different place. The only album that I had on CD was this album. A couple months later, I was given an electric guitar for my birthday, and I learned this album front to back on guitar in about a week or 2, and I just fell in love with music, and I fell in love with this band all over again. And I give this album a lot of credit for kind of introducing me to the more music and getting me into playing guitar and wanting to write my own music. So I have to commend this album for that. That being said, I think this album is where they took their first dip into some weird experimentation, and I think it really paid off. I think it was there's a lot of tracks this album was weird when it came out, because you had their first 3 albums, and then you have a song coming on the radio like Supermassive Black Hole. That was weird. That must have been really weird to hear back in the day. But I think this album just is, it's so good, it's so consistent in its experimentation, and I think the songs are really, really solid. They're super interesting. The instrumentation is varied. The guitar work is insane on this album. It's the drumming is so tight. The bass work, Chris just seems to be flying all over the bass, and it sounds like he's trying to keep up with Matt. It's just an adventure, and I think this album is fantastic. But my number 2 pick, it kind of took over. I wanted it to be number 2 so bad, but it's got to be number 3.
All right then, best and worst tracks. My favorite tracks from Absolution are Hysteria, Blackout, Butterflies and Hurricanes, The Small Print, Endlessly, Stockholm Syndrome, and Apocalypse Please. My least favorite track is Time Is Running Out.
My favorite tracks on Black Holes were Starlight, a masterpiece, Map of the Problematique, a masterpiece, and Nights of Sidonia, a masterpiece. I've been pretty nonchalant and in the middle about everything, but this is my hot take. This is my nostalgia hot take.
Okay.
My least favorite track and one of the worst songs Muse have ever made, Supermassive Black Hole.
Oh no!
Fucking awful song.
God, why do you have to say this? No.
Okay.
I have to say something.
Okay, well.
Fucking okay, buddy. Okay, buddy.
Alright. That's not right. That is not right.
Mick's gonna dox me.
Right. Well, I can't even think now. All right, my favorite tracks were Take a Bow, Starlight, Supermassive Black Hole, Map of the Problematique, Invincible, Assassin, and Knights of Sidonia. My least favorite is Soldier's Poem.
All right, top 2. All right, my number 2 pick is Origin of Symmetry.
My number 2 pick is Absolution.
My number 2 pick is Absolution.
Same order.
All right. I think Origin of Symmetry is another kick-ass album from Muse. And I feel like this is definitely a step up from Showbiz, and they're kind of growing into their own kind of sound because, the comparisons you could make to the band that shall not be named are pretty much gone on Origin of Symmetry, in my opinion. I think the production on this album is just awesome. I love the guitars. They just sound so fucking great. The atmosphere of what's going on, it just sounds so cool. The best parts of it for me are easily Matt Bellamy's incoherent howling, because it works so well with the large sound of these instrumentals, and it just keeps me relatively excited. not a single like track on here leaves a dull moment, in my opinion. There's just too many tracks on here that I think are just incredible, and they just work for me. They're among some of Muse's best songs, in my opinion. And yeah, that's all I have to say about Origin of Symmetry. I'm just going to keep it short and sweet. Good album.
Yeah. Previously, I admit I kind of was a bit harsh on this album. I never really found anything interesting, but it has kind of clicked with me after a few listens. I still don't think it's perfect, but I think it's a very good and like very interesting album. It to me feels like the most calculated and meticulously crafted Muse album, and I think this ends up serving the very grandiose, very massive, very just this word's kind of ruined, but epic sound of this album. And you know, it does have one or two tracks that I don't care much for, but those are very minor issues, and overall it is an album that I do enjoy, an album that I will come back to more often, and maybe it'll grow on me even more. But you know, considering I had this album sitting at like a 4 or a 5 at one point in my life, I will admit that this is a strong 7, and I do like this album.
Woo!
4 or 5, imagine. Okay.
Could be me.
Okay. Yeah, no, never. All right. Absolution. This was the album that I was wrestling with Black Holes and Revelations. And all I can say is, I don't mean to shout your name, but nostalgia. That is all I get from this album. I heard
thank you.
I heard Time is Yes, you're welcome. I heard Time Is Running Out and Hysteria on repeat when I was 4 years old. This album is ingrained in my brain, and for a long time I was like, oh, this album's, it's really fun, it's really, it rocks, it's really cool. And then I dove into the lyrics, and this loose concept that they explore on this album is so interesting, with the whole idea of the world ending and everyone getting raptured. This is definitely like soaked in like these themes of Christianity and like all these beliefs of like what would happen when the end of the world happens. I think this album starts out brilliantly with the opener Apocalypse Please, and I think it just starts right there and just never lets up. This album, up until like a month ago, I had at a 10. This album is so solid. It's so fun to listen to. It flows very well. The bass lines are memorable. The riffs are memorable. The energy that's on this album can't really be matched by most bands. And I think, considering that this band is a 3-piece, they rocked this album hard and gave people an album to pay attention to and listen to and just get lost into.
Nice. Alright, my favorite tracks from Origin of Symmetry are Hypermusic, Microcuts, Plug-in Baby, Megalomaniac, and Space Dementia. My least favorite track is Bliss.
My favorite tracks on Absolution were contender for my favorite Muse track, Stockholm Syndrome, Falling Away With You, Butterflies and Hurricanes, Endlessly, and I kind of want to preface this with, this is a song that there was a point in my life where I would probably jump out of a window anytime I heard this track because of just how frequently I had to play this on drums with my band. But now that I don't have to play it like 3 times a day, and I can kind of step back from it, the song fucking kicks ass. Hysteria. And
yes!
the tracks were Apocalypse Please and Blackout. And shout out to Josh, the bassist in my old band, who fucking kicked ass on bass for this track.
My favorites on this album were Apocalypse Please, Time Is Running Out, Stockholm Syndrome, Falling Away With You, Hysteria, Butterflies and Hurricanes, The Small Print, and Thoughts of a Dying Atheist. Yes, this album's good. My least favorite track is Endlessly.
All right. Number 1. I'm the contrarian here. I went with Black Holes and Revelations.
I will say for my number 1 pick, the first thing I did before I sat down and listened to any album was I put this album at number 1 because I knew nothing was changing. My number 1 pick is Origin of Symmetry.
Yes, my number 1 pick is Origin of Symmetry.
Nice.
Again, same order.
I like being the contrarian here, of course.
Yeah, it's actually quite entertaining.
Yeah. Anyways, Black Holes and Revelations. Honestly, before listening to this album, I had no expectations going into it. But then after listening to it, I was just left in awe. So what I did after was listen to it again. And then again. And then another time. Like, this album just takes everything that would make Muse great. And it just, in my opinion, improves on the sounds they toyed with on Absolution with way better production, better songs, and more consistently good material. Like, honestly, the space rock opera like sound suits a band like Muse well, and I honestly love it. The guitar work on this album is incredible to me. I love so many of the riffs on here. The atmospheres and the grandness are so alluring. The synth work became more prevalent on here than on Absolution, but honestly, the synth work is probably some of the best that Muse have ever done in their catalog. And plus, I think they do boldly wear a bit of Queen influence on their sleeve at times. But honestly, I don't mind it a lot of time. I think it works well with this whole like space rock opera concept. I think that Matt Bellamy's vocals match the wild energy and the calm grandness of some of these instrumentals very well. I think that everything else in the instrumentation just sounds great. I think that the songwriting is some of the best in Muse's catalogue, and I just gravitated towards this album more than any other Muse album for whatever strange reason, but I love it. I love it to bits. I genuinely love the shit out of this album, which is why I have it at my number 1 spot.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Right, as harsh as I am towards Muse, I'm generally not really a fan of their sound. It doesn't really excite me. This album's just a completely different story. I think this is an amazing record. I think a lot of the band's best material is here, and it's very, very saturated in really good material. The instrumentation in particular is incredible. I think the guitar work here especially is gritty, it's stellar, it's explosive. Matthew Bellamy, just pretty much all of his best performances, in my opinion, are on Origin of Symmetry. I think the Radiohead comparisons are just completely gone out the window. I think Matt Bellamy said, no, fuck Radiohead, all my homies hate Radiohead, we're fucking Muse. And they made a fucking amazing album, and one that I don't think they ever really matched in terms of quality. Maybe they'll surprise us, but I think this album is amazing. As harsh as I am towards Muse, there's never any denying it. I never thought any differently of this album. I've always said I'm not a Muse fan, but I'm an Origin of Symmetry fan, and I think I'll stand by
that. It's perfect. See you guys later. Thanks for tuning next week. Okay, no, here we go. All right, Origin of Symmetry. I have no shame in this. This album's a 10. This album is so unbelievably good. I remember the first time I heard it, I was, still that, Black Holes and Revelations stan, and I heard this album, Newborn kicked on, and I was like, you know what? I kind of hate Black Holes and Revelations now. This album, it's... I know that like both of you brought it up, but I feel like they heard those Radiohead comparisons and they're like, oh really? We sound like Radiohead. Okay. And I think it just sounds like Matt just wanted to prove to the world like what he was capable of. I think this album solidified him as a guitar genius and a piano genius. There's these songs Like, whether or not he's behind the guitar or he's behind the piano, he is just going off on all of the instruments, all the performances. Like, his vocals are howling. He's flexing his, vocal presence, and he is just giving it 110%. As for the other two, yeah, they're okay. It's not like the bass riffs. It's not like the bass riffs are really cool. Or it's not like the drumming is fantastic or anything. It's like it's just like this band. It's just they, especially with the feeling that I had on Showbiz, where it's like they wanted to prove something to the world. I think they took a step back and they're like, yeah, no, we can definitely do better than that. And they just hunkered down, wrote these crazy riffs, these crazy songs, and just put it out there for the world to see. And I think they did a fantastic job. This is one of my favorite albums of all time. Definitely in my top 10. If you haven't heard it, please go listen to it. Oh my gosh, go listen to it.
All right. My favorite tracks from Black Holes and Revelations are Assassin, Exopolitics, City of Delusion, and Hoodoo. I do not have any least favorite tracks. This album is incredible front to back, in my opinion.
My favorite tracks on Origin of Symmetry are Newborn, Space Dementia, Citizen Erased, and my favorite Muse song, Plug-in Baby. My least favorite track, if I had to pick, would be Feeling Good.
I mean, I love every single song. I love every single song on this album, and I mean, you're not going to get me to choose a least favorite, but I'll give special shout outs to Newborn, Hyper Music, Plug-in Baby, Microcuts, and my favorite Muse song of all time, one of my favorite songs of all time, Citizen Erased.
And that is it. We've ranked Muse's discography. Woo!
Yeah, we did it.
Yeah, thanks for coming on today, Josh. It was a pleasure having you on.
Hey, thank you for having me. I hope to join in the future.
For sure.
You will be joining in the future very soon. Announcing soon. Emphasis on soon.
Yes.
Anyways, so, yep, like I said earlier on in the episode, expect the Swans Worst to Best to come soon. That'll be like 2 hours long. Any bets?
Yes. Oh, I can't wait.
Either way, thanks very much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. Whose opinions did you agree with most? Let's just get some comments going. What do you think? How do you rank Muse's discography? Necessary links in the description to my own channel, Nostalgia's channel, our album of the year and rate your music pages, Josh's album of the year, and yeah, see ya.
Peace.